The human spirit, when all is in harmony, finds its natural state in peace and freedom. A spinning top dancing. Moments of love and joy resonate with ancient truths. Respect for the divine, for family, the heart's call to do unto others as we would have done to us. This is the promise of humanity, to ease suffering, to honor the human condition, to live with hope and meaning in every breath. Yet shadows fall across this light. There are people in our world robbed of their freedoms, their very lives stolen, and this film shines a voice for the voiceless, calling us to stand for justice and to awaken and to act.
The year 2006 threw a curveball at me when I was surprised by a breaking news in the Epoch Times. I learned that in China, the wife of a surgeon, she was reporting that her husband, a neurosurgeon, actually confessed to her that he took the corneas of 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners in a Chinese hospital. And that was something I've never imagined this was even possible. Two investigators from Canada, David Kilgo and David Mathers, were actually conducting investigation into this topic. They called the hospitals in China, pretending that they are patients. They wanted to find out if they can have healthy organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And in 14 cases, the hospitals, the doctors on the other side of the telephone basically admitted that they have only these fresh organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And that was something I have to say I would never have imagined. In July 2006, I attended the World Transplant Congress in Boston, and I talked to two doctors from China. The first one said they did 2,000 liver transplants in the year prior, and that was an astonishing number. And I was surprised, where do those organs come from for these transplantations, since China didn't have an organ donation program. Then I found another doctor and asked where the organs come from. And he told me that the organs are coming from Falun Gong practitioners.
So Falun Gong, which is a spiritual Buddhist school practice rooted in truth, compassion, and tolerance, with 5 Qigong meditative exercises, was first made public after thousands of years of antiquity in the early 1990s, in 1992.
After I had this conversation with these two Chinese doctors, I decided I have to do something. And I wondered, what can I do? I'm just a single voice, just a doctor with English just being a second language. What can I do? And then I realized we should actually have a medical organization that looks into it. So I decided that it should be me who start this organization. And this is how our organization, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, came to life. In the beginning, we realized that this is not the regular type of commercial organ trafficking where kidneys are being sold for money on a mutual agreement, but here in this case, people were killed for the organs, and there was no term at that time in 2006 that would even describe this type of atrocity. So we came up with a new term that is forced organ harvesting, and that means that people are being killed to harvest their organs, of course, without consent. Nobody would consent to be killed for their organs. Forced organ harvesting is probably the biggest violation of ethical standards and even legal standards in the world in this century.
I'm Professor Lavee, Jacob Lavee. I'm the director of the Heart Transplantation Unit here at the Sheba Medical Center, which is affiliated to Lavee University School of Medicine. I'm also the president of the Israel Transplantation Society and the chairman of the Heart and Lung Transplantation Committee of the Israel National Transplant Center.
I'm a geriatrician, so I specialize in the care of older adults, and I really went into medicine because my grandmother suffered some very serious medical issues that weren't really taken care of well by the medical system at that time. So I actually went into medicine to try and advance the field of geriatric care.
My name is Weldon Gilcrease. I'm a medical oncologist. I'm a cancer specialist at a large university academic practice with a specific focus in liver cancer. One of the primary reasons for my being interested in medicine was the use of science for the betterment of humanities.
My name is Charl Els. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and I work in private practice. I'm also on academic faculty. I'm involved at the John Dossator Health Ethics Center at the University of Alberta.
My name is Harold King. I'm a retired dental surgeon. I was shocked to discover that the Chinese government initiated the extermination of Falun Gong practitioners using surgeons and hospitals. I immediately sent an email to Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and since the end of 2007, my wife and I joined DAFOH and have never stopped working to end forced organ harvesting.
I have been an IT expert for a long time at a basic research institution in Germany, and I worked 10 years in a university hospital. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner. I am also not a doctor, so I can't speak freely what I think about the attitudes of some Western and, of course, Chinese doctors. I do this pro bono because I think a crime against humanity has to be denounced publicly. And you know, I am a German and I know what happened in Germany. And a big problem was not only Hitler, a big problem was also that the German populations, also German doctors, didn't refuse to participate in these crimes against humanity.
What brought me into this whole issue of the organ transplantation in China was a patient of mine back in 2005 who waited for almost a year in my department for a heart transplantation. He was on the top of the Israeli list of candidates for organ transplantation. And one day he came to me and told me, Professor Lavee, I was told by my insurance company that I should go into China and to undergo heart transplantation in China. And they told me that I should go in a certain particular date 2 weeks ahead of time. And I looked at him and asked him, how come they can schedule a heart transplantation 2 weeks ahead of time? You know that somebody has to die on that particular day in order to make his heart available for you as a donor. And he said, I didn't ask. And the patient went into China and got his heart exactly on the date that he was promised 2 weeks ahead of time. So that has made me start looking into what's going on in China and to find out, to my horror, the law that has been enacted in China already back in 1984, which enables and permits the use of organs from executed prisoners for the purpose of organ transplantation.
I've been a transplant surgeon for almost 18 years and at some pretty busy transplant centers. I had a patient who needed a liver transplant, but his cancer was far too advanced to allow him to be placed on the list in the United States. And he was not placed on the list in the US, and he went to China to receive a liver transplant. And he received one very quickly. And he came back to the United States, and in a few months he came to me again, and he said, I had a transplant there, the liver has gone bad, and my cancer has come back. Can you transplant me now? And I said, no, I can't transplant you now. The reason that your cancer came back is because you were at too high a risk of cancer. You shouldn't have been transplanted. And in fact, when you transplant a person in that situation, it makes the situation worse because now they're on immunosuppression that lowers their immune system, and the cancer cells can progress more rapidly because now your own body doesn't even fight the tumor.
This was puzzling to most people that were hearing this. How can you schedule a transplant in advance? How can you schedule a transplant in 2 weeks? that has to mean somebody is being murdered essentially for the organ that you're going to receive. And so you saw on-demand payment for organ transplants that were occurring within China. You saw this enormous uptick of transplant activity that was occurring within China. And you essentially have websites as well that were advertising online, come to China, pay X amount of dollars for whichever organ, $60,000 for a kidney, $120,000 for a liver, $150,000 for a heart, and we will get you a transplant. They would advertise that their average waiting time for something like a liver was 3 to 4 weeks. And to go back and put it into context, this is at a time when there was no organ donation or distribution system.
With the current knowledge of transplant surgeon how to preserve organs from donated people, we can preserve organs from, as far as heart are concerned, for as short as only 4 to 5 hours most, and with kidneys up to 12 hours. So this means that every organ donor needs to die on the very same day that organ transplantation is taking place. So the only way such an operation can be promised ahead of time to any potential candidate is if the surgeon knows for fact that his potential donor, so to speak, if you can call it a donor, will die on the day of the scheduled operation.
When I read Matas and Trey's book on state of the organ, that opened my eyes. And when I saw the videos of people giving testimonies of what was going on in terms of the prisoners of conscience, which were initially accepted as icons in society, to lead a clean life, to then be imprisoned for their beliefs, becomes the most revealing to me. But what's even more revealing is what happens to them when they've done nothing criminally wrong.
I was actually just walking through Sydney and saw a poster for a flyer of a talk by David Matas, who was giving a breakfast seminar, and I had never heard of organ harvesting in China. I was actually astounded by what I heard at the seminar. I didn't believe that in this modern day and age that medical doctors could be actually acting in such an unethical way. And it really motivated me to find out more about it and seek out organizations. And that's where I found Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, which I joined soon thereafter.
My initial interest in forced organ harvesting was actually one of wanting to show that it wasn't happening. But then when you spend enough time with the evidence and the data, which is the major driver for most people that are in medicine, you quickly become aware that this is a problem of enormous scope, that innocent people and innocent lives were being taken in China for profit and to try to extinguish specific populations within China.
Well, I was the European Parliament Vice President for Democracy and Human Rights, and I was also the European Parliament spokesman on that subject, and I was writing a report in 2006 for the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee on democracy worldwide and human rights. When I visited Beijing in May 2006, it was to investigate reports of the persecution of Falun Gong, which had been taking place since 1999, and in particular, the forced organ harvesting from live prisoners. And I didn't believe at the time that this could possibly take place in a modern country, but if it did, it would constitute genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention.
Needless to say, when you hear a vivid and chilling story like this, it almost seems horrific to believe. But when I looked at the evidence, the report that came out by Matas and Kilgore, and in my conversations with Mr. Kilgore, I've certainly come to know the evidence better, and certainly it's beyond a shadow of doubt in my mind that this is what's happening to this day in the People's Republic of China.
When I first heard about this, my first reaction was, this is impossible. Doctors don't do this. I couldn't believe this. And it took me long time and a lot of investigations until I was really convinced this happens from the abundance of evidence. The problem is there is a little bit too much evidence. A normal person has not the time to read those hundreds of pages of evidence. And so they simply don't believe it.
The topic of forced organ harvesting is so unusual for us in our civilized society that we often cannot comprehend it, and we also don't know how to handle the evidence. There's a historic example where a Polish diplomat, Jan Karski, visited the Warsaw ghetto, and he observed that Jews were deported. Later, he came to the United States and shared his observations with the Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. And Frankfurter said, "I cannot believe you." Another diplomat who came with Jan Karski, he said, "Are you saying Jan Karski is lying?" And Frankfurter responded, "I didn't say he is lying. I just said, I cannot believe it."
I think this is the problem with such a horrendous crime as organ harvesting. It is so terrible that people simply don't want to believe it. And it's difficult, of course, to find proof because all the bodies are incinerated, all evidence of the crime is erased, and we have to rely on the testament of those who, to give us a couple of examples. Somebody I interviewed had been to visit his mother in a prison in China, and on his way to see her, he'd noticed 2 prison guards outside a particular ward, and there were about a dozen people in this room. And he said to his mother, "What is going on down there? Why are there 2 policemen outside that ward?" And his mother said, "Well, those are Falun Gong prisoners awaiting organ transplants to be taken from them, not to be given to them, of course."
I would like to say to Western doctors to suspend your disbelief and actually inform yourself about what's going on. Ask yourself, how can Chinese doctors do so many transplants? How can Chinese transplant surgeons know nothing about procurement or where the organ came from? How can Chinese transplant hospitals make so much money? I would ask them to ask those questions and to be prepared to listen to the answers.
Evidence should never be dismissed just because of disbelief. We should continue to look into it. And the same applies to forced organ harvesting. Even if we cannot believe it, we should still look into it and not dismiss it. When we started to look into the evidence, at the beginning it was very tedious because it was not easy to find the silver bullet that would explain all of it. Naturally, it is very difficult to collect evidence in a country, in a totalitarian country, as it is in the case of China. So what happened is we were looking into small details here and there in the data and information, etc. So it became almost like putting a puzzle together where we find like little pieces, and although the little pieces don't give us the full picture, but they helped us to understand what was happening. And over time, we found 5 categories where these pieces of evidence would fit into. So these 5 categories are our approach to summarize the evidence that we have collected. The first category, the most important one, is probably all the witness reports, the testimonies, because they give us very detailed information, they add credibility, and also it pushes us forward to look for more data.
My name is Feng Huang, born in 1960. I worked at the Chinese Academy of Sciences doing scientific research. I started practicing Falun Gong in 1995 because I've long been interested in martial arts and Qigong. On April 21st, at the Guangzhou Army General Hospital, the nurse took 2 tubes of blood, tested it, examined my eyes, and did an ECG. They asked if I used drugs. I said no, I don't smoke or use drugs. They said my heart was like a drug addict's. Dr. Lin on duty said I needed to stay for observation due to a fast heartbeat. At the same time, Dr. Dong from the Brainwashing Center called the center's chief. saying I needed heart surgery at 6:30 p.m. that day and to inform my family. But Dr. Lin corrected her, saying observation was enough, not surgery. Dr. Dong insisted on surgery within 3 hours. They asked if I'd signed authorization for the surgery. I refused. They sent me back to the brainwashing center instead of keeping me in the hospital. That was my first encounter with the organ harvesting attempt. It was dangerous. If I signed the authorization, I'd have been on the operating table with no control, possibly subjected to organ harvesting. They failed that day. Afterward, for 3 days, every hour, 8 people, police and security guards, force-fed me, beating me simultaneously. My weight dropped drastically and I nearly died. They failed to break me as I still couldn't eat or drink. They then sent me to the Guangdong Province Judicial Policeman Hospital. There, nurses took my blood, tested it, and injected me daily with unknown substances, just like at the brainwashing center. On June 5th, they examined all my organs: lungs, eyes, heart, kidneys, spleen, liver, using extensive ultrasound and X-ray scans. They used a lot of lubrication and paper, filling half a large container. The X-ray took over 30 minutes, scanning every detail from my neck to my lower body. For my heart, the doctor used a speakerphone, discussing my heartbeat with someone else over the phone, saying, "Listen to how strong and regular it is." The sounds were loud and clear.
My name is Xu Duo, born in 1969. I lived in Lianhu District, Xi'an City, Shanxi Province. I studied aerodynamics in university but gave it up after graduation. After practicing Falun Gong, I quit smoking and drinking. My bad temper softened as I cultivated truth, compassion, and forbearance. My family, especially my brother, was amazed. I'd failed to quit smoking 3 times before, so this impressed him deeply. After the persecution of Falun Gong began, we tried to tell ordinary Chinese people that Falun Gong is good and that the Chinese Communist Party's CCP, baseless persecution, was wrong. On April 12th morning at Taoyuan Road Police Station, they wanted to test my blood. I refused, saying I feared they'd harvest my organs. A 610 official pointed at me fiercely and said, "We're going to harvest your organs." That afternoon, handcuffed and escorted by 2 officers, I was taken to a hospital in Xi'an City Center for another blood test, ECG, blood pressure, and other checks. At Ankang Hospital, they did a full-body CT scan. I wondered why they tested my blood twice. Blood type doesn't change. The CT scan wasn't for my health. If they cared about my health, they'd have released me. I kept thinking about the 610 officials' words about organ harvesting. Would they do that to me?
I met 2 practitioners, both were married, and when later on Zhan Liangying was released from prison, she sent me a long email listing the 50 types of torture, escalating torture, from brainwashing up to physical abuse. For example, she was regularly suspended from her neck by a rope from the ceiling of the cell with her toes just touching the ground for hours on end. Torture like that, and ending up with beatings and so on, and concussion, and then coma.
I also had the opportunity to interview some Falun Gong practitioners who escaped from prison. And basically they told me different experiences. One said she was actually detained for 2 years but was blood tested 10 times. And there's no reason for a practitioner who's subject to torture and forced labor to conduct a medical examination. So what happened is probably that this person was targeted 10 times as an organ donor, because you need the blood testing as a match before you can donate organs. This happens actually in other cases too, where in one detention camps about 200 Falun Gong practitioners were transported with buses to the hospital, and all of them were blood tested. In one case, there was one who resisted, and that person was pressed down on the ground by 8 guards just to force them to withdraw this blood. So it is almost like a forced medical examination that Falun Gong practitioners experience.
I think that there's no way to explain blood testing and other kinds of physical exams for people who are being detained and in some cases tortured. This can't be being done for their good health. So to me, it sounds like what's happening is that they are being blood typed, and you only need simple blood typing now for transplants because we have such good anti-rejection drugs. So, but blood typing vast pools of individuals would allow people to be able to find matches very, very quickly with very short waiting times. And in fact, that's what we know is going on in China today. I think that most people in the West don't have any idea that Falun Gong practitioners and other detainees are being blood tested. I don't think there's any knowledge about it in the West at all, except for very rare individuals who've actually looked into it themselves.
So when you hear reports from Falun Gong and others that they're being tested, there's blood examinations, tissue type examinations, it is because you're trying to make sure that you can quickly match a donor to a recipient. And it's another indication that you're not getting consent. You've already decided this person is going to become the organ donor. Moreover, it's not an accident. That's the people that you're looking at when you hear these reports are younger, healthier.
Another piece of evidence is that we have many witnesses from people in China who had been detained in Chinese detention camps and prisons. They had many very detailed medical examinations in the prison, testing their organs with X-ray and eye examinations and kidney and liver examinations. It was not that all prisoners were tested like this. Most of the prisoners tested were Falun Gong practitioners. They were selected for these medical examinations.
Well, I think it was the interviews with actual Falun Gong practitioners who had been detained, some of them tortured, some of them blood tested, and then escaped or were released. And I found their testimony quite compelling. And in addition, it was the fact that people had called Chinese hospitals, spoken to Chinese surgeons who actually admitted that this was going on. So I found that evidence to be a quite high level of evidence. I think there is still a large degree of incredulity on the part of some transplant surgeons who have not actually researched the evidence themselves and just don't believe, because they wouldn't do it, don't believe that colleagues in another country could be engaged in this sort of practice either.
The things that made it very credible for me were the multiple reports of examinations, of physical examinations from prisoners of conscience who were detained in the labour camps. It seemed that those stories, that evidence had come from those people around the world, people in Australia, in America, in Southeast Asia, who'd been incarcerated and escaped. And they all had the same story to tell, but they hadn't all had a chance to meet up and decide what story to tell. So it was coming independently from all these different stories. So to me, that made it seem very unlikely to be fabricated. How could you get all these different people fabricating the same story? So that seemed to me it was definitely true that people were being examined for their organ health and no other reason. So that was one thing that made me think that was true. Another was the sheer number of transplants that Chinese doctors had done, that hundreds of transplants. And again, in other countries, people don't do that many transplants. It's still a relatively uncommon operation in that there's always a shortage of organs. So the sheer number of transplants that the doctors had done was another convincing feature.
One of the most important pieces of evidence in forced organ harvesting is just the explosion of the number of transplants, just simply looking at the volume of transplants that China was doing in the early 2000s. When you start to look at the data and you start to look at an explosion of transplant activity within China, you see numbers that just don't make sense. So in the 1990s, China, for example, by their own numbers, were doing about 10 liver transplants per year as a country. There is no organ donation or distribution system that's active within China. And by about 2004, China does 3,000 plus liver transplants. So in a short time, they amped up their transplant activity, and specifically, especially within liver transplants. So the initial response by the Chinese transplant system was that this is coming from our organ donation system. But again, China doesn't have an organ donation system.
When we looked at the transplant data from China and observed and monitored it for several years, we saw discrepancy between China and other countries. And numbers in other countries usually have a gradual increase. And you can compare it with when you come from the North Sea to Germany and Netherlands, the land is increasing very slowly. But when you come to China, I would compare it with crossing the US. You start off at the Pacific in Los Angeles, and all of a sudden, the numbers climb up like the Rocky Mountains, and afterwards, the people in the world notice or heard about forced organizing, they drop down, and for 10 years, they just remain steady on the same level, around 10,000 per year, like the Great Plains. And then after 2016, they increased again, like crossing the Appalachian. And this is something that is really unusual, that the course of transplantations has such a different character.
The exponential growth in organ transplantation in China stands in contrast, total contrast, to what's going on in most other Western countries doing organ transplantation. In most other countries, there is a very slow growth of 1 or 2% organ transplantation more per year. We in Israel have managed to increase it in more than 10%, but to see an increase of tens and tens of percent in the number of transplant is something that hasn't been seen anywhere in the world.
I think the exponential increase in both organ transplants as well as persecution of Falun Gong is too coincidental not to be linked. And the fact that many of the Falun Gong detention camps were very close proximity to the large transplant centers. And in fact, some of the same individuals were in charge of both persecution as well as transplant activities in China. All of that evidence suggests that these things are actually inextricably linked.
Well, China, if the numbers are correct, and I have no reason to doubt that they are not, has seen a 300% increase over the past 20 years, at least that much, in transplants done. They haven't seen, by anybody's imagination, a 300% increase in organ donation from those who have died and their families. I mean, it's a hard thing to shift to that. I understand it. We had a hard time doing it here. Every country that has tried to build an organ donation system finds resistance. Some people say, well, it's Chinese, it's cultural. It isn't. Israel, Denmark, the United States, everybody's had a hard path to make the move to trying to encourage people to donate organs when they die and to get families to be comfortable. But to push a 300% increase without having a cadaver system means there's only one other possible source. It's got to be prisoners. So I find myself thinking, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the claims, China still must be relying on prisoners as the only way to fuel that expansion, and that isn't right. It's still an unethical practice. Maybe it brings money, maybe people get transplants and they feel glad that their lives are extended, but murdering people to get parts is simply not the way to proceed.
The idea that the number of transplants has remained stable at 10,000 a year for the last 5 to 10 years is not credible. We know that the numbers were increasing rapidly until 2006, when China became aware that the world was starting to become curious about their transplant system. And since then, they seem to have settled on 10,000 as a reasonable number. But when you look at the number of transplants that individual surgeons have done, it's not believable that only 10,000 a year are done when some surgeons are doing 200 each, which can rapidly add up when you've got thousands of surgeons across China.
The third category are the short wait times. So when you go to a hospital here in the US, you have probably to wait 5 years for a kidney or a year for a liver. But in China, it is common practice that you can get any type of organs within 2 weeks. And in some cases, it was actually demonstrated that you can get an organ within 1 or 2 days. It was even reported in Chinese media that this happened.
So to be able to get a transplant on demand would mean that you have a vast number of people that you can analyze to select a most appropriate donor.
Well, yeah, the disjunct between procurement and transplantation is one. The short waiting times, the availability, that was another red flag, that you could have this many organs available so quickly. There's short emergency waiting times. Again, that's information that's come out more recently from the update, with some hospitals with extraordinarily short waiting times. I think the shortest was at 4 hours to get a liver transplant, which again is just astonishing that you could get a transplant that quickly, an emergency transplant. So those are the kinds of things that you wouldn't get in a system such as Australia, where people go onto waiting lists. There's not a very quick and ready supply of organs, extraordinarily short waiting times that are not replicated anywhere in the world. So that seemed to me there's something very unique about the Chinese system that couldn't be explained by any of the normal mechanisms for even people selling kidneys and so on. You wouldn't get matches that quickly, I don't think. So that was one thing.
Patient has been waiting for an organ donor for 3 years in Korea. But it took just a few minutes for the doctor to say, "We can do it right away." How long does the patient have to wait to get a transplant?
It's so urgent, so we would do anything to get it done soon.
Some take it in a week if they're lucky, 2 days. But also possibly some wait 1 month or more. Or 1 week, a few days. It all depends. And the only way to make it shorter is to donate some cash to the center. You pay the regular bill and pay the extra.
How much would it be?
100,000 yuan.
Then 15,000 US dollars?
Yes, 15,000.
What is the regular cost?
A kidney is 130,000 US dollars.
If he pays 130,000 US dollars plus the extra, can he have it as soon as possible?
Yes, then when an organ comes, we will let you have it first. All I do is report it all to the chief, all about it. And when he confirms it, everything goes that way.
In 2013, China introduced a so-called public organ donation program, and around the world, the medical doctors were relieved because now China is on the right path. But that's actually not true, because we found plenty of discrepancies and flaws in this organ donation program. Basically, this organ donation program is an illusion. It's a decoy so that doctors in the West are pacified.
One of the important things to understand about China and Southeast Asia is within the cultural fabric of China, there's an ancient belief, actually based on Confucius, that out of respect for your mother and father, when you die, the body should stay intact going into the next life. And this is out of the respect for the hair and the skin and the bones that your mother and father provided for you. There's really a cultural opposition to transplant within Southeast Asia and in China specifically. Even to say, well, there's a large number of Chinese, so these transplant volumes make sense. It simply doesn't make sense without having some victim group, some population that is functioning essentially as a population that's killed on demand for organ transplants.
Given the fact that, number one, there's no brain death law in China. Number two, the idea of brain death is totally strange to the majority of the Chinese population, and the fact that most Chinese population do not trust the medical system, and therefore to think that this type of population who is still deeply entrenched in the belief that the body is sacred and should not be desecrated by donating organ, to think that this type of population would miraculously starting to voluntarily donate organs in the numbers that will replace the thousands and thousands of organs that have previously been donated by executed prisoners is something totally inconceivable, and therefore the only other explanation for the exponential increase in the number of transplants would be if there is an extrajudicial source of organs in that country.
I do not believe that the system has changed in terms of transparency or in terms of meeting the actual guidelines for organ transplantation that are internationally accepted. What I do believe happened was a bit of a semantic trick in terms of how do we define voluntary donations. I do not believe that anything has changed in the People's Republic of China when it comes to organ transplantation. They've tried to obfuscate the issue. To this day, they continue to hide this elephant in the room in the plain sight of the international community. I do not believe anything has changed to date.
Given that China's only had a voluntary organ donation system for a very short period of time, it seems astonishing that they should be able to have those numbers of transplants so quickly when we haven't been able to achieve that in other countries where we've been working for a very long time to try and increase our organ donation rate. My guess is that the figures are falsified, that they're inflated in some way. There's one other feature that's very interesting about those figures. In Australia, where we have some of the world's best practice, we, on average, can only get livers from about 60% of our organ donors. The liver's a very sensitive organ, and it's very hard to have a donor where you can get a healthy liver. And so the best we can do in Australia is 60%. And in Australia, 3/4 of our donations come from patients who are brain dead, which is the patients where you have the best possible quality livers in general. In China, by contrast, they get livers from 80% of their donors, which is extraordinarily high. It's 60% compared to 80%. And the other thing about that is that in China, they don't have consistent brain death legislation. So most of their transplants come from donation after circulatory death, which is very difficult to get healthy livers. So there's something very strange going on in China. How are they able to get livers from 80% of their donors when they're mainly being certified dead on circulatory criteria, and we know that compromises the liver?
The liver is the one that's particularly sensitive to that situation because the bile ducts of the liver require a lot of oxygen. It's probably one of the most vascular or blood vessel filled areas of the body because those bile duct cells require so much oxygen. If a person goes through this process of donation after cardiac death, and it takes too long for them to expire, and we take that liver anyway and transplant it into a patient, it might work, but 3 or 4 months down the road, we're going to have problems with bile duct necrosis, death of the bile duct cells, infections inside the liver because of damage done to the bile duct, and that person will have to have a transplant again. That's why only about 30% of the time when we think that we're going to get organs from a donor after cardiac death are we actually able to use the liver. To me, there's only one plausible explanation, and that is there are a group of people that are being set aside as potential donors. They're being evaluated ahead of time. They're being kept in some place until there's a potential recipient. And then that person is having their organs procured after whatever means it is that they claim is the means by which that person died. And that death was probably brought about by someone who wanted to make the death progress quickly or even not even completely before procuring those organs in order to protect the liver, because the liver is going to be the most sensitive to problems with the bile duct during the process of death. So either death is not quite completely occurring before organs are being removed, or the death is being progressed very rapidly so that the organs can be removed rapidly, primarily to protect the liver. To me, there's no other plausible explanation as to how so many organs can be ready on a moment's notice to transplant a patient within hours of them being placed on a list, if there is a list. That's the only explanation I can see.
Organ transplant registries take many, many years, decades to set up in all of the countries that have them. In China, it's only been 3 years since the organ registry was set up. And to have all of their organs supplied by this registry in that period of time is not believable. It's not credible. It's not consistent with evidence we have from any other country, even countries which have very, very advanced systems of organ lodging of types of organs and blood typing and transplant mechanisms for getting organs across large distances very rapidly, which you have to do. All of that coordination of materials and information and computer data is not existent in China, as far as we know, with this registry system across the vast land of China. So I think it's not credible on any level, and it's completely inconsistent with what we see in every other organ registry around the world. Unfortunately, I think that there are examples of fabrication of data across Chinese industries, whether it's healthcare or baby formulas or building standards or bridge materials or medical pharmaceutical products. There are many, many examples of China not being completely truthful in what's going on. So I think we have to take everything that comes out of the medical system in China with a grain of salt. We have to have many sources to replicate data before we can actually believe what is said. But there's no way that 25,000 people being on a registry could actually be the only source for 3,000 or 4,000 donors in a given year. It's not possible. I think that the number of donors who are registered compared to the number of transplants in China is very high. So in America, for example, there are 150 million people registered to be donors, and every year 15,000 of them die and become donors, or people who are on and off that list. So that's a huge ratio. So to have a third of the people on the transplant list becoming donors in China, for example, last year, is not believable by any standard.
We conducted another analysis where we looked into the organ donation program and the numbers of registered organ donors and simply applied the death rate in the country on these numbers. One would expect that the death rate applies to registered organ donors as much as to non-registered organ donors because it's just the population. So what we found is that at the end, about only 1% of the registered organ donors become actual organ donors. And this is observed in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, and other countries. This is a steady number. But when we look into the official numbers that we observe from China, then you find that actually 12% of the registered organ donors become actual organ donors. So somehow in China, the registered organ donors died 12 times as much as in other countries.
I think it's impossible that China has gone from a system of 100% or nearly 100% of organs being harvested from prisoners to 100% being harvested from ordinary citizens, if you will, in 3 years. I think it's impossible. And I think something that is quite disturbing is the fact that Huang Jiafu at least 2 press conferences has actually stated that he has reclassified prisoners as citizens capable of donation. And as we heard from his earlier press conference on the 730 report, he doesn't understand why people would object to that. He doesn't see the moral problem with coercive consent for people who are imprisoned. So therefore, it is very, very dangerous to believe his words and his colleagues' words that citizens who are not prisoners anymore or who are capable of consent form the vast bulk of organ donors.
We've stated in our American Journal of Transplant paper the fact that it's inconceivable to accept the fact, the declared fact, that the number of organ transplantation which have so far been used by executed prisoners in China has miraculously been replaced within only 1 to 2 years by the voluntary donation of the Chinese population.
Transparency is the most important criteria. Transparency creates trust, and that is crucial in the field of transplant medicine because you have 3 people involved, which is the doctor, the organ recipient, and the organ donor. That is very rare in the medical profession that you have 3 people involved. And usually in the civilized world, that is happening, where all 3 parts are treated with respect and there's transparency between all of them. But in China, this trust cannot exist because there's no transparency.
Transplant is the only field where you have someone giving them of themselves, giving a part of themselves to someone else to save their life. It's the whole foundation of transplant is built on a gift of one person to another. And to see that part of transplant so ignored and bastardized the way that it's being done in China is despicable.
The last category is probably the expansion of the transplant infrastructure itself. It was reported that although the official numbers did not increase, hospitals were actually reporting increase of revenues. They had more doctors working, they had more hospitals, more than actually the donor numbers would explain.
It seems from information taken from the website of the 309 military hospital that their income over 5 years increased from organ transplantation. So it increased from 30 million yuan to 34 million between 2006 and 2010. This seems extraordinary that there would be enough organ transplants to generate, first of all, that kind of profit, and then that hugely rapid increase in profit over a short period of time.
To this date, China is the only nation on earth that has systematically used both its military as well as its civilian hospital system in collaboration with the judiciary as well as the prison system to systematically harvest organs from individuals, prisoners of conscience, and they do so for profit. So at this point, China still is the country with the greatest number of executions, exceeding that of all other nations combined. This can be compared with the genocide in Rwanda. This can be compared to the Holocaust. And certainly the psychological impact of this globally as well as on the citizens of the People's Republic of China will be felt for decades to come. Even if this stopped today, the psychological backlash and impact will still be felt for many years to come. And I do not think we're adequately prepared for that today.
I think the magnitude of the crime against humanity that continues to go on is so big that it's simply impossible to grasp by anybody who is not really involved in organ transplantation. And the fact that there's no videotapes or pictures never taken inside these prisons or inside the hospitals where this forced organ harvesting is done is a problem, a part of the problem to bring the message of this crime against humanity to the entire world. I mean, you have to be really a professional and see the numbers that are coming out of China in order to believe that this crime is really taking place in China.
We also have it as our mission to inform the medical community and the public about this atrocity. And we did this with different means. One was, for example, a petition that we had over 5 years where we collected 3 million signatures. Another approach was writing articles in medical journals. Then we have organized more than 24 webinars in different countries to basically inform doctors in those countries about this practice. Another campaign was our World Summit, where we invited 39 speakers from around the world to discuss this topic of forced organ harvesting.
In June 2024, the G7+7 petition was initiated to speak directly to the G7 leaders and bring them the voice of the people of free and democratic countries, asking them to stop forced organ harvesting in China. By learning about Falun Gong, its practice, its belief, and how the Chinese Communist Party has persecuted Falun Gong for 27 years, this petition will break the imposed silence.
I guess one of the questions I was asked earlier is, why am I so involved? And I think I've always been somebody who stands up for the underdog. And I think this is ultimately one of the biggest underdog good versus evil stories that we've seen, especially within the medical community. And I feel passionate about the work I do for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, an organization that has been nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize, won the Mother Teresa Social Justice Award in 2019. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting represents really a voice for the voiceless. There's a 680-page report that's available online called The Bloody Harvest, The Slaughter and Update. And they looked at about 160 different transplant centers through China. In this 2016 report, their conclusion was that China was doing about 60 to 100,000 transplants per year as a country. To put that into context, officially the United States is the leading transplant country in the world in terms of volume. Last year, the United States did 48,000 transplants. And so you're talking about a system, a very nascent system, when you compare to the United States, something that even if you take the Chinese transplant system at its word is only 10 years old in terms of an organ donation system. And they're outperforming us, by a third.
When it comes to organizations, transplant organizations, medical organizations, we sometimes observe obstacles from the leadership of these organizations. And it's not just like a lack of belief or not comprehending it, but rather a willful blindness, I would say. So we also wondered why the leadership of these medical and transplant organizations were not willing to look into forced organ harvesting, were not willing to do their own investigations. We realized that it is not only like a willful blindness, but also probably interest to have the opportunity to go to China, because if they would look into it, they would probably not be invited if there is a conference or congress in China.
In the last 2 years, the American Transplantation Society and the World Transplantation Society, where Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting used to be able to have a voice, be able to be admitted to the meeting and have a booth and talk to those that are interested or those that are concerned or those that may not know about forced organ harvesting, we are now a censored group and outcast by these two transplantation meetings. Instead of saying, well, we can produce data, we can produce evidence that China continues to use innocent lives, innocent human beings, killing them on demand for organ transplants, where's the data that it's not happening? We are no longer invited into those meetings.
By taking the stance that things are fine in China, without evidence, without audit, without any clear demonstration of a shift in practice, the WHO risks losing its leadership role as an ethical beacon or light on these matters. And that would be tragic because no one else is in a position to hold that role.
So obviously, the victim of forced organ harvesting is being killed and incinerated, so there are no traces. And the doctors who committed will not say that they just killed a person and removed the organs from their person. The news media had a kind of like expectation in the evidence that simply cannot be fulfilled. It is illusional.
I think one of the reasons why people don't believe it is because it just simply seems so unbelievable. And the fact that something like this can still happen in the 21st century, I think people do just find very difficult to understand. And I think without any concrete evidence, because the problem is the lack of transparency, openness, there's no magic bullet that we can show people to say, well, here is your concrete evidence. And all the evidence that we have comes piecemeal from lots of different sources. And from our perspective, we look at all of those different pieces of information to get our impression as to what we think is going on. I think for some people, especially if they are not medically qualified or if they don't have an understanding about transplantation, they can't fully comprehend the allegations that we are putting forward. And I think there is a lack of awareness on this issue.
The international transplant community, as I understand it, first of all, was very condemning of organ harvesting from prisoners, and then chose a pathway of trying to work with China to improve their system. And I can understand the wish to try and help China to improve their system, because clearly it's a horrendous system. But I'm afraid that some of the doctors have been naive. A good example of this is the recent Transplant Society conference, which was held in Hong Kong for the first time. This was immediately portrayed in the Chinese media as a sign that the world welcomed China onto the transplant stage. It was seen as condoning Chinese transplant. It was seen as a celebration of the great strides being made in Chinese transplantation. I think it's very serious because it then people come away thinking, oh, things are changing. I've been to China. They showed me a list of voluntary donors, or people go to China and believe what they see. And I don't think they realize that they're not being shown what's actually happening. They're being shown the face that China wants to show the world. And because we don't do that to the same extent in this country, people just don't understand it. I mean, we certainly, we show people our nicest hospitals, we show people our, cleverest surgeons, but we don't create something like a theatre set when we have international visitors. But I think when Australian doctors go to China to look at the transplant system, they're basically getting a theatre set.
The fact that the Chinese authorities have allowed for a pre-prepared, pre-arranged visits of medical experts from the West of only 6 out of the more than 600 transplant centers, and they didn't find, so to speak, any evidence of forced organ harvesting in that particular visit, doesn't say a thing. This particular visit brought into mind a similar visit by the Red Cross during the World War II into the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where it was prearranged and it was shown to this particular group of visitors as if it was a nice, quiet, cozy recreation camp of the Jewish kids.
And the fact that they aren't willing to have independent investigators going or a transparency with regards to their data, their transplantation numbers by center. They usually provide us with aggregate numbers, which we cannot verify. Most of the registries that they have for liver transplants, kidney transplants, heart and lungs, you can't verify any of the data. So the fact that they don't want any investigations of their numbers, they don't allow any independent investigations of their practice, would suggest that they do have something to hide.
We know that in the New South Wales Parliament, when a member of Parliament attempted to hold a conversation about organ harvesting in China and to propose a bill to address that, members of Parliament received a letter from the Chinese embassy suggesting that it would be better not to go to the meeting because they wouldn't want to jeopardize the cordial relations. So we see a lot of overt and covert threats against speaking out because China wields such huge economic power at the moment.
Our organization, as well as other organizations and investigators who look into the forced organ harvesting, have certainly triggered the Chinese government and pushed them to reply to it. And the official reply is that this does not happen. So they deny it, and they even pay the media in the West to not report about it. There are probably like two major aspects. One is that China is paying a large amount of money to have inserts in different newspapers. So of course, if the newspaper is reporting about forced organ harvesting, then they lose the business for these inserts. But another aspect is that there are courageous journalists who report about it. That happened, for example, with Didi Tadlov, who worked for the New York Times some years ago. And she was courageous enough to report about this forced organ harvesting, but her work was not appreciated. And at one point, she just decided to leave the journal.
I've been joining my friends in DAFOH in this fight against forced organ harvesting in China for the past 11 years. There were ups, there were downs, there were times that we, myself, thought that we are fighting against forces that are far, far beyond our power.
I think the small handful of countries that have put in place legislation or regulations preventing their citizens from traveling to mainland China to receive an organ from this particular source certainly is an example for the rest of us. Certainly we know that there is not always the political appetite to do the right thing, but part of our duty is to raise awareness and to not stop doing so until this issue is resolved.
It was not easy to get people's attention But over the years, we were breaking through these obstacles, these walls, and these sometimes willful blindness, which resulted in more and more people were standing up and learning about it. And it also was an inspiration to other groups. So we see now, for example, films, for example, state organs, which has received tremendous feedback from the audience. We see that more and more governments are willing to consider legislations, and it is more and more discussed in other media and, for example, podcasts and webinars. So I would say right now we see, after many years of breaking through the wall, that now the wall has some cracks and the information is reaching the public. There's a saying that goes, truth will prevail. And this also holds true with our work. When we bring up the topic of forced organ harvesting, the Chinese government often replies by saying this is a political topic and they don't want to talk about it. And this was a way to dissuade doctors in the whole world to even talk, to even mention forced organ harvesting. And I would say the Chinese government was right. Ethics, and especially the Hippocratic Oath, was probably the first political statement in medicine where it says, do no harm, do not kill people. So in this regard, they are right. It's a political topic and we should not shy away to address forced organ harvesting.
About a month ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a liver transplant expert. She trained at the leading liver transplant system in California in the United States. She had no idea that forced organ harvesting was happening, what it is, how it's defined, what the evidence is, how much evidence there is out there. I think you've had this erosion of, I guess, the Renaissance man, for lack of a better term, within a medical system where you're sort of expert on multiple things. And so I think there's often a desire to say, go talk to this one person, they're the expert. Instead of saying, it's my duty, it's my obligation to, as an individual, understand and come up with my own determination of whether it's happening and my own determination of what I'm going to do about it and what we should do about it. There is still a huge lack of awareness within the medical system and even within the transplant system.
At one point, I realized something that I experienced myself in my medical studies, in my medical training. We're supposed to rotate between different disciplines in medicine, and one of the disciplines was surgery. So I was helping out with some, holding hooks, etc., and assisting. And I was basically thinking about what I learned in the textbooks. And at one point, I realized that, the surgeon is cutting the skin of the patient. And when I started to think, then I started actually to faint. And later, actually, the doctor told me that this is normal. This happens to many, many students, but it only happens once. I came to the insight that at that moment, my knowledge shifted from textbook knowledge to real life knowledge. And that is the knowledge that is really needed to understand what forced organ harvesting is. If there's no emotional reaction, then you're probably still in the textbook knowledge where you hear verbally forced organ harvesting, but you don't actually realize that people are killed so that the organs can be harvested.
I think the transplant community has been problematic. I can understand the difficulty. If you make this public and make this known to every individual within the medical community, as well as the public at large, you may have a large population of people that no longer want to be organ donors, and you have essentially pushed the transplant field to the limits of absurdity, to the point that you have lost trust by a well-intentioned public. And so there have been groups that have taken a stance, but I think what you see more often is silence. And the reason that I think you see is silence is it's trying to keep the field of transplant clean. One of the issues that we're dealing with now is that in December of 2014, a Chinese transplant surgeon, Wang Jifu, made a statement at a seminar in China saying that by January 1st of 2015, China would stop using executed criminals for transplant.
How do you expect that we should have you run the world if this is how you treat your own people? That's the same thing with what's taking place with communist China. How it treats the Falun Gong is more than barbaric.
By 1998 or 1999, the Chinese official numbers were that there were somewhere between 70 and 100 million Falun Gong practitioners. It had spread mostly by word of mouth. Falun Gong was really resonating with the ancient traditions within China. This was something that I think was a huge threat to the Chinese Communist Party, which was not rooted in ancient Chinese ideology, ancient Chinese concepts like respect for the divine, respect for your family, the fact that you do unto others as you would want done to you. I mean, a lot of the elements that I think permeated ancient Chinese civilization resonated with the Chinese people through Falun Gong. And so through mostly word of mouth, the practice exploded. Jiang Zemin, who was head of the Chinese Communist Party, I think was very jealous. The Chinese Communist Party is used to coercing people through threat, terrorizing them through fear and intimidation, through lies and deception. But Falun Gong represented something different. It was resonating with the hearts of people who were practicing something that, again, I think really resonated with ancient values and ancient energy practices that were commonplace through China.
What Falun Dafa believes in is truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance or forbearance. And then the Chinese government, what they believe in is completely opposites. They just fear anything else besides them gaining more power, and so they wanted to put it to a stop.
On July 20th of 1999, Jiang Zemin set in motion a flooding of innocent prisoners of conscience within the Chinese prisons, labor camps, detention centers, brainwashing centers across China. In fact, the United States State Department at one point estimated that more than half of victims in labor camps within China were Falun Gong practitioners. Ethan Gutman estimates that the number of Falun Gong practitioners that were being imprisoned, detained, tortured throughout China was about 450,000 to 1 million. If you take 70 to 100 million practitioners of Falun Gong in the late 1990s, even if you have 1% of them within prisons and within prison systems, you have about that number. You have close to 1 million innocent lives that are languishing and essentially dehumanized by the Chinese Communist Party within their detention centers and their labor camps.
There are different incentives. The doctors who practice the forced organ harvesting, they get paid in money, and the salary is often dozen times higher than the regular salary that they would earn otherwise. So it is a very profitable, lucrative business for doctors in China to commit the forced organ harvesting. But there's another side to it, and that is the incentive of helping to eradicate, to destroy Falun Gong practitioners, and that is in the interest of the Chinese government. They started to destroy this group since 1999, but were not able to stop it. So they were looking for another way to achieve their goal, and this way, the forced organ harvesting became like the final solution for the Chinese government, where they can slowly eliminate, exterminate all Falun Gong practitioners in China without the international community actually noticing it.
Jiang Zemin saw much more in Falun Gong than a simple health exercise and a Buddhist religious practice. Jiang Zemin wanted to destroy Falun Gong and its belief. He wanted to dirty it and humiliate it through brainwashing, torture, rape, social and psychological rejection, so that no Chinese citizen or anyone else in the world would ever listen to Falun Gong practitioners. He used all the People's Republic of China's power and finances to ensure global silence on the subject of Falun Gong.
Some of the estimates even 10 years ago in 2015 or so is that this was a $9 billion industry within China and a major economic interest of the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a side benefit, I think, of money, but I don't think money is essentially what it was about for the Chinese government. I think for the Chinese Communist Party, the intention was to eradicate a population from the face of the planet, to terrorize that group so much that other people that were Falun Gong practitioners would be too afraid to continue practice, and essentially carry out the edict of Jiang Zemin, who in 1999 said, "We will destroy them physically, we will bankrupt them financially, and we will ruin the reputation of Falun Gong practitioners within China," which was what he set out to do. And as far as I can tell, even with Xi Jinping today, this has been something that has never been reversed in terms of the intent.
We're constantly talking about prisoners when we look at China, but there are all kinds of prisoners. There are prisoners there who are prisoners of conscience. They may be there because of spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs they have. They may be there because they are ethnic minorities, unhappy with the central government. They may be political prisoners, in other words. They may also be people who are convicted with very harsh sentences of financial crimes and other things. So there are all kinds of prisoners. So when we lump them together, we're missing the fact that some of the prisoners shouldn't be there. Some of them are inappropriate prisoners. They shouldn't be in that situation. And then using them to say, well, you have a death sentence, and because you belong to a spiritual group or a religious group or whatever political persuasion, we're going to kill you to get parts. That's obviously wrong. Ironically, the very health habits that Falun Gong might pursue, no drinking, no smoking, moderation in lifestyle, lead them to be healthier, and they're younger usually. That makes them even more of interest if you're looking for healthy organs. So it's kind of a targeting, if you will, of who's likely to be the best organ donor. And then you have this pre-testing, which we don't do with donors here. We basically see who donates, then test them after their death to find out who they might match. But when you're doing it beforehand, it's sending a signal. These are people we intend to kill in order to get their parts.
Well, my concerns are that people who are prisoners because of their beliefs, generally religious beliefs, are being treated as a commodity. They're being, instead of being treated as human beings with the rights that should be extended to all human beings, they're treated as a living organ bank who can be killed whenever it's deemed necessary in order to put a transplant into someone who can pay for it. So essentially, instead of being treated as an individual with rights who deserves respect and dignity, they're treated as a walking, talking organ bath from whom the organs can be removed at convenience.
I think there's a unwillingness to look into the details of what has happened in China, and there's a perception that it's just too big and too vast and too different, and so maybe things do happen on a different time scale. Maybe if it's a state-sanctioned system, maybe they are able to set up a registry within 3 years instead of 3 decades. So I think it's a real kind of Western ignorance of maybe how things work. If you've never worked in China, maybe you don't know how things operate there, and so you will believe what people tell you. I think that's really what's happened.
I think if the public at large recognizes what has happened and recognizes the fact that we sat on our hands as a medical community for decades, I think that's a huge threat to the initial obligation to care for patients, to care for them in a way to ease the suffering of human lives, to ease the suffering of the human experience, to help patients that are afflicted with various disorders. We've lost any kind of trust. We have pushed medicine to such an absurd point that it simply becomes a farce.
We have observed this struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government and Falun Gong practitioners. And you can compare it with the spin top. It's the struggle between gravity that wants to drag down the spin top and the centrifugal force that helps the spin top to spin. If Falun Gong has all the freedom to practice its faith, then you can say it has overcome the gravity of the CCP, the control. It has shaken off the control from the Communist Party. And then you see the spin top spinning freely. And if you take it to the next level, then the spin top is not just spinning, but actually almost dancing. And this is what you can observe when you see Shen Yun, where Falun Gong practitioners express the freedom of their faith on stage.
She wants people to know the cruelty of the Chinese government and the CCP.
感谢你给我们这个机会。
Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
谢谢，谢谢，
Thank you.